Hi, I'm Renee Ng, and welcome to In Focus California, the show where we delve into the issues that matter to you. We talk to lawmakers, community organizers, and others who shape the policies that affect your life. Today's topic, a chemical that is all around us in our food, drink, places where we recreate, and it's the most widely used pesticide in the world. We're talking about glyphosate, the chemical in Roundup. Now, some are asking if it can make you sick, even kill you. Just days ago, a federal jury in San Francisco answered a resounding yes to that question and awarded Edwin Hardiman more than $80 million. Hardiman alleged his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was a result of using Roundup to kill weeds on his San Francisco Bay Area property for 2 years. It is the second such jury award. The first was in California's state court just a few months ago.
I'm a loving husband and a real good dad, but weeds just make me rattlesnake mad. Now,
Roundup is Monsanto's popular weed killer. It's been on the market since the 1970s.
I remember when I first talked to my partner about bringing a lawsuit against Monsanto, and all the law, we're in this room, this conference room, we're all sitting there, and they said, "Brenna, you crazy, you can't sue Monsanto."
But 3 years ago, Brett Wisner did just that. He took on the agriculture biotechnology giant, the Monsanto company. The claim, glyphosate, a chemical in Roundup weed killer, caused his client's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Dwayne Lee Johnson, a father of 3, was just 46 when he got the cancer diagnosis. He worked as a groundskeeper for schools in Northern California. Wisner estimates Johnson sprayed 150 gallons of Roundup over 2 years.
The first thing he did is he actually called Monsanto and said, "Hey, is this stuff that I'm spraying, could it be the cause of my cancer?" They said, "Well, we'll have a doctor call you back," and then no one called him back.
So Johnson called the Baum Hedlund law firm. Just the year before, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, had evaluated glyphosate and found that it's probably carcinogenic to humans.
We have the scientific literature, we had experts from around the world.
Wisner and his team presented evidence like this 2003 study from the Journal of Occupational Environmental Medicine. It reads, use of several pesticides was associated with NHL incidents, including glyphosate. NHL stands for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
We have internal Monsanto documents.
Like this Monsanto email about the IARC cancer ruling. It says Monsanto's message should be that IARC has done the public a disservice by creating baseless fears with a cancer rating for glyphosate and calling the rating confusing and open to distortion by alarmists.
We showed this to this very intelligent, very thoughtful jury, and they heard all the evidence. They heard Monsanto's side of it. And they said this stuff causes cancer. And on top of that, they concluded that Monsanto's conduct was done with malice, with reckless disregard for human life.
The jury awarded Johnson $278 million. A judge reduced it to $78 million. Monsanto is appealing. In response to the federal case, Monsanto issued this statement, which reads in part, "We are disappointed with the jury's decision, but this verdict does not change the weight of over 4 decades of extensive science and the conclusions of regulators worldwide that support the safety of our glyphosate-based herbicides and that they are not carcinogenic." Still, in California, glyphosate is listed as a known carcinogen under Prop 65, which requires businesses to post warnings about exposures to chemicals that cause cancer or birth defects. And now glyphosate is banned in Los Angeles County.
That if you Google alternatives to, there are many that can be used. Some are more expensive, but what price do you put on a person's health?
While banning the chemical may cut down on human contact with it in parks, Brett Wisner says almost everyone is exposed to it one way or another.
In every single piece of food you eat, almost every single piece of food, there's Roundup. In every beer you drink, in every glass of wine you drink, and it's everywhere.
In fact, CalPERG did a study and found glyphosate in beer and wine from the US, Europe, and Asia, even in some organic varieties. Here's a list of the wines and beers that contain the chemical. Sutter Home contained the most at 51.4 parts per billion. Of the beers, Tsingtao ranked highest at 49.7 parts per billion. The only beer and wine tested that had no glyphosate was Peak Beer. The study concluded that the amounts of glyphosate were relatively low, but still carry some risk.
And every time you eat Wheaties, there's Roundup.
Testing by Food Democracy Now! And the Detox Project found glyphosate in these popular foods, including Cheerios, which had a whopping 1,123.5 parts per billion, while Honey Nut Cheerios had just over 670 parts per billion.
Roundup has been used for years, and every year 70,000 people are diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. What percentage of those people are being caused by Roundup, I don't know. But the simple fact is, if anybody has a loved one that has been exposed to Roundup and got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, they should call a lawyer and see if they have a case, because they probably do.
Monsanto also develops genetically modified crops that are resistant to Roundup so that farmers can dump the weed killer on crops without harming the genetically modified plants. The plants are sterile, so farmers must buy new seeds from Monsanto each year. Current genetically modified crops include soybeans, corn, canola, and wheat. Monsanto also made saccharin, PCBs, DDT, both widely banned, and Agent Orange. Monsanto is bracing for an onslaught of lawsuits. So far, more than 11,000 suits have been filed against the company. A Southern California woman who lives in Oceanside is also suing. She used Roundup to protect her coffee crops, and like so many others, she got very sick.
I was 54 and I felt tired and I had hot sweats. No woman at 54 who feels tired and has hot sweats imagines it's anything other than menopause.
Back in 2003, Christine Shepard and her husband Ken were living in Kona, Hawaii. They had ditched their corporate careers in California 7 years earlier and decided to try their hand at coffee farming.
Well, the coffee farm that we bought was completely covered in weeds. It had been left to go.
To clean up the farm, Shepard says they used Roundup weed killer.
We were told it was perfectly safe. In fact, the agricultural agent told us it was safe enough to drink. So, I'm doing this in shorts and a tank top and the backpack sprayer, no protection whatsoever.
Shepard sprayed Roundup once a month over 2 days on their 5-acre farm for the next 6 years. One day, her leg swelled up. She went to her doctor. The diagnosis, stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, with 6 months to live. Shepard and her husband sold the farm and moved back to California to focus on her chemotherapy.
We had gone there expecting that we would live out our days on there. So that whole lifestyle went away. And a Hawaiian lifestyle is very tough to give up.
The cancer went into remission in 2005.
It wasn't until 2015 that the World Health Organization came out with the link between Roundup and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I saw this report and I read it and I shouted to Ken. I said, "Look at this. It's Roundup. It was the use of Roundup that did it."
Shepard jumped into action. She sued Monsanto.
And mine was the 4th case to be filed.
She's still waiting for her case to go to trial. But seeing what happened to Dwayne Lee Johnson gives her hope.
I think probably that I won't see it in my lifetime, but I think eventually it will happen.
These days, Shepard focuses on her favorite hobby, weaving, and spending time with her husband at their home in Oceanside. But never far away, the worry, the cancer will come back. If you could send a message to Monsanto, what would that be?
I think I would just rage at them at how they can do that to people just to make a profit. I think they should go to jail. I really do. I don't think people should get away with things like that.
Shepard says she wants Roundup taken off store shelves and out of people's lives. She's getting her wish from one major chain. Costco says it, quote, is not planning to sell Roundup this season. Costco refused to say if it's because of health risks. When we come back, we meet a local farmer who used to use Roundup. Stay tuned. Welcome back to In Focus California. I'm Renee Ng. A Ventura County farmer says he used to use Roundup and he used to believe Monsanto's claims that it was safe. But he says he no longer uses a weed killer and he no longer thinks Monsanto was telling the truth. And he says he owes his newfound knowledge to Dwayne Lee Johnson, the man who first took on the agribusiness giant Monsanto.
It gets into the plant and it kills the roots as well as the plant.
Farmer Phil McGrath says it's great for getting rid of weeds like this on his 300-acre farm in Camarillo.
The Roundup that I used to use in the 70s and 80s and partially in the 90s, we didn't use it really as an herbicide on our tractors. We used it on a backpack. We had a guy going around spot checking different weeds that way.
But that was before McGrath went organic on his family-owned farm in the mid-90s. He grows strawberries, beets, carrots, mushrooms, and other types of produce, which he sells at farmers markets throughout Southern California.
In 1995, I had taken over farmer markets, and these wonderful people in LA were grabbing my produce, pulling up the carrots and asking me if this is organic.
McGrath eventually gave in to customer demands and stopped using chemical fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides on his farm.
I was told when we were using Roundup that it had 0 to no effects on the environment and really didn't hurt anybody.
McGrath says he now has reason to believe that's just not true, that a chemical in Roundup called glyphosate can cause harm. Dwayne Lee Johnson, a former groundskeeper who sprayed Roundup continuously for 2 years, sued Monsanto, the maker of the herbicide, claiming it caused his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. A jury agreed and awarded him $289 million in damages, an amount that a judge later slashed to $78.5 million.
That lawsuit changed everything. They've got studies now that prove that it can get ingested and it doesn't break down and it is a bad chemical.
He says many farmers still use it. After all, it's cheaper to pay one person to spray Roundup than to pay multiple people to do the weeding.
Now, if you had Roundup back in the day, would you just spray this?
That's exactly what they would do.
And how quickly would it get rid of the weeds?
Roundup would kill these weeds in a couple hours.
McGrath says once the chemical is in the soil, plants can absorb it, and that's how traces of glyphosate end up in our food. McGrath says the best way for consumers to protect themselves is to avoid as many chemicals as possible.
Eating good, clean food is so important as drinking clean water and breathing good air.
Even if clean food costs more, the U.S. Department of Agriculture says as much as 20% more. But McGrath says eating organic and staying healthy could stave off disease and save consumers big bucks in medical bills.
In the long run, it's cheaper to eat organic. It really is.
When In Focus California returns, we talk to an environmentalist about the glyphosate found in beer, wine, and in our food. Welcome back to In Focus California. As we mentioned earlier, the most widely used weed killer, Roundup, contains a potentially cancer-causing chemical, glyphosate. We are exposed to it through food, drink, and the places we recreate. Joining me now to talk about the situation and how this chemical has been allowed to flourish for years is Dan Jacobson with Environment California. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So recent studies, I understand, have shown that Roundup can end up in adult beverages, can end up in our parks, on our school grounds. How does that happen?
It happens because we're using too much of this particular toxic chemical. And we did a report recently that looked at Roundup and saw that it's getting into our beer and our wine, even organic beer and wine. But it's a concern not just because it's there, it's a concern because the World Health Organization has listed this particular chemical as a probable cancer causer. And when that happens, we've really got to take steps to be more careful.
So you mentioned it ends up even in organic food where supposedly no pesticides are used. How does that happen?
It happens because oftentimes the way that this particular pesticide and herbicide is applied is it's sprayed either from airplanes or it's just sprayed on. And when that happens, there's no way to contain every ounce of that particular chemical. And oftentimes through drift in the air, in the water, or on land, these particular herbicides can move from one field to another. And if you have an organic field that's next to a conventional field, that's oftentimes how this stuff is ending up in our food.
And what about the number of people that are exposed to it? Is that on the rise?
You know, it's gone up significantly. It's gone up over 500% in the past 15 years. And a lot of that is because the amount of this particular product that we're using, this Roundup that we're using, is going up significantly. I mean, it's the #1 seller by Monsanto. We're seeing it used not just in the United States, but all over the world. And it's not just on products that are on farms that this is being used, but it's being used in our lawns, on parks and schools, really everywhere now. And it's a significant level of concern.
And you mentioned Monsanto, who makes Roundup weed killer. They seem to tout that it's safe. Why do you think they keep sending this message out there if it isn't?
Well, I think you should have them on and ask them that question. I mean, there have been studies that, like I said, the independent group, the World Health Organization, has already looked at this. They've got significant levels of concern.
And what about the levels of Roundup that end up showing up in our food and drink? Are they pretty low? Is it safe?
It meets the safety standards that the EPA has set out, but for instance, let me give you an example, and I think this might be the best way to do it. In 1 glass of wine that might have this Roundup in it, if you just drank 1 glass of wine, you would be under that exposure. But if you drank 3 glasses of wine, then you might be over the exposure.
All right. And here in LA County, it is banned. So what do you think people in other counties can do to protect their parks and schools?
I mean, there's a lot that people can do. First of all, just in your own homes, you can reduce the use of this. Second is you can go to your school superintendents and ask them not to use products that contain these glyphosates in them. Third is you can go to your city hall and make sure that they're not using them in the parks or the recreation areas that are around your city. And fourth, contact your state elected officials and tell them that we need stronger state action in order to protect us.
All right. And finally, one more question before we go to break. If someone has a container of Roundup in their garage sitting there, what should they do with it?
Oftentimes, counties have got programs that are set up where people can call up and you can either drive to dispose of it, or they'll have these particular days of the month or days of the year when you can lay these products out, and county experts will come and help to dispose of it properly.
So pouring it down the drain, for example, not a good option?
That would be on the list of the worst options that you could do. So let's try to avoid that.
All right. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Dan Jacobson from Environment California. This time, we'll look at how Monsanto convinces some agencies that the chemicals in Roundup are safe. Stay tuned. Welcome back to In Focus California. I'm Renee Ng. We continue our discussion about Roundup weed killer and the potentially cancer-causing chemical it contains. With me again is Dan Jacobson with Environment California. So Dan, let's touch on Monsanto. They make Roundup weed killer. Do you think that company has acted responsibly?
You know, what I know is that we have a particular product here in the United States and all over the world that's being sold that the World Health Organization, the state of California, and others have listed as a probable cancer causer. I think what they need to do is pull that product from the shelves right now and test it and make sure it's safe before they put it back out.
But Monsanto maintains it is safe. Why do you think they do that?
Well, they're in the business of selling a particular product, but I think the real question is who is in the business and who should be in the business of protecting the public's health. It's very concerning when we're finding out from some of the top public health institutions in the world that this has the potential to cause cancer. I mean, that alone should give everyone pause, should make us stop, should make us examine this particular product, but also the way that products are coming to market without being tested thoroughly.
And there's agencies like the EPA, for example, that seem to take Monsanto's word that it is safe. What are your thoughts on that?
The EPA, we think, has been too closely aligned with Monsanto and with some of the other chemical companies here, and they should be putting the public's health first.
Do you think lobbyists play a role in the EPA kind of accepting Monsanto's word that this product is safe?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, lobbyists in our political system is set up in such a way where people with the most money and corporations that use a lot of money can influence the political system, and, you know, that's horrible, and we've got to be able to change that. But right now, we've got to focus on making sure that we're protecting our health, the health of our kids, the health of our grandkids who are playing in these parks, who are eating this food, who are going to schools where this particular product is applied, and we've just got to use common sense and make sure that we're putting the public's health first.
And I also understand there's some studies that are ghostwritten for Monsanto. What do we know about those?
Well, you know, this is an instance when there's supposed to be independent scientists are supposed to come in and do an examination for the EPA or for other bodies, and what we have found over time is that the hand that's guiding the pen on those particular studies has been done by Monsanto. And again, it's just part of a disconcerting part of the whole political process. And what's disconcerting is that when you find out that Monsanto or other chemical companies can then apply pressure and influence the way that those particular reports are being written.
All right. And do you think Monsanto is being deceptive?
Yep.
And one more question for you. Do you see any parallels with tobacco companies or even opioid makers like the Sackler family?
Yeah, I see parallels that are very similar. And again, it's instances where we're putting the public's health comes in second or third place, and the profits for shareholders are coming in first place. So with big tobacco, it was always, how do we make the most amount of money for the tobacco industries? For the opioid crisis, it's how do we make the most amount of money for the pharmaceutical industry? And that's too bad. And that's having a literal impact on the quality of our lives, on the quality of millions of people's lives in the United States and all over the country and all over the world. And it's time for Congress to step in. It's time for the United Nations to step in and say, you know, we're not going to go with what makes the most amount of money. We're going to go with what provides the best protection for the people in this country and in the world.
That's it for our show today. Thank you so much for joining us. To see more of our stories, go to spectruminfocus.com. And we're interested in what you think. Please post comments on my Facebook page at Renee Ng News. And you can follow me on Twitter at Renee Ng, where you can get the latest updates on the show. Thanks for watching.